A long time ago, I gave up on the idea of multitasking unless it refers to killing 2 or more birds with 1 stone. I find it is actually pretty hard to throw more than 1 stone at a time accurately. As shown here, I'm doing 2 things to my design with these additions. First, this horizontal stitching will blend with the existing far shore stitching. Second, I do these sort of vertical spiky hair and vague tree and bush shapes to fill out the landscape and mimic shadows in the water at the bottom. And these aren't very good, of course. I try a little harder when I'm actually quilting to refer to my picture and then try to do something that seems like would really exist in nature. My priorities are that the shapes be interesting, trimmable, somewhat detailed, and positioned to fix any problems, which includes tightening up the whole far shore area, which on both of my pieces seemed a little baggy as originally stitched. And I'm mostly planning to avoid my lights on my full-size piece. So here I am using my teal and white variegated thread and my designated tree and bush fabric, which is a print. White on the back, it will show a lot of gray along the fray. On my mini, I use the same thread plus an orange one and several scraps of a few different black batiks. Batiks are very tightly woven and don't fray as much around the edges, and so they don't look as fuzzy. That's why I use them exclusively to bind pot holders. I could have used my fairy frost for adding trees and bushes on both of my pieces. I did want a little bit more distinction between the far shore and these plants and bushes, so I didn't use fairy frost for either one. I'm adding fabric shapes to simultaneously heighten certainty and uncertainty about what exists in this landscape, if that makes any sense. I'm trying to create that space where we are passing from one stage to another and we're not firmly rooted in either one anymore. That's that liminality that I talked about in Lesson 0. I'm also trying to add movement, detail, and interest. Not that there's anything wrong with a little simplicity and stasis once in a while. At the same time, I want to create an overall feeling of balance, which may be why I chose an inspiration photo that is nearly symmetrical. I know this kind of trimming sort of overuses the hands, so I work on these trees and bushes on my 2 pieces in 3 separate sessions on different days. This way I don't get tired or bored, my hands don't feel sore later, and I won't settle for less for the wrong reasons. I pace myself. I can't work like a maniac for weeks on end like I did 10 or 15 years ago. It really wasn't good then, but I seem to get away with it. Now I go slower and do less of the same task in the same day. I just plan better. Also, you can trim in a way that uses less movement and makes a lot more little tiny scraps. And just for the videos, I wanted you to be able to see pieces emerging without me making a total mess. But I'll trim some of them that way towards the end of the video. You can see that I address these planted fabrics along the horizon first, and I feel I can build in front and below them in these next steps and make them more complex. Now I'm placing 6 or 7 pieces of fabric around the far shore, trying to think of everything as I work. One thing I know for sure, I want to distract from my lemon slice. Working around the orange lights is pretty easy. They aren't that big, and they are already tightening up the quilt in those scattered areas. When I'm doing something like this, I avoid clustering my efforts all in one area. What I mean is, I try to work a little here, some over there, some across the quilt on the other side, some near the bottom, etc. I've noticed that I'll stitch differently on different days. Just like my handwriting can show how tired or alert I feel, my stitching can show how I'm feeling that day, how tired I am with the project, whatever. And I don't want all of the stitching to be in one area unless I'm purposely trying to make the foreground much different than the area a little further back in terms of the landscape. And so I just like to hop around to different areas and then the next time I work on it, I'll do the same thing. So it's not clear and obvious that, oh, I quilted all this one day and I quilted this the next, and they look very different. This could also play in if you had your tension slightly different one day. So all your better tension is in one area or similar tension. And I would prefer to spread it apart, and hopefully all the tension falls in the good to great category. Trim tolerances aren't really as important with stitching that's this dense. If these were raw edge applique shapes like hearts or flowers outlined with one line of stitching, things would be different, and trim tolerances would be more important. I do use a few pins to keep these added fabrics where I want them as I shift my work around, and this would be even more important if I weren't working on my flatbed. I spend some time adding plants and shadows at the waterline, making sure to cover my lemon slice in the reflection enough that it doesn't bug me anymore. I still have a couple other techniques I'm going to use down here, some inking and thread sketching or thread painting. The line between those two techniques is fairly blurry, and I guess it's a little bit more painting at the point that I'm going to be doing it, but we'll see that a little ways down the road here. This feels like enough for today, so I'll come back later. When I'm quilting, I make up a lot as I go along, and so if I can do the thing I've thought of, I just do it. If it's something for later on, I'll grab my notebook and jot a little note. At the end of a session, I may have 5 or 10 new notes. I may not have any. But I'll look over those as I go forward with my project, crossing things off either because I've done them or because I've decided they weren't good for this project. And sometimes a note will go on to another list for something to try in a different project where it would be more appropriate. And so I do try to capture ideas when I have them and not let them fly away, never to be thought of again or to be thought of a year later. I try to preserve the voids in my original quilting. So I move the pieces around, think, move them again, and then settle on a plan. In this case, I use 2 chalk colors, one to mark the stitching I have planned in white, and one to remind myself not to stitch over my void in blue. So far I've shown you a process where I stitch one piece of fabric, then trim it, then move on to the next. Normally I might stitch a handful or even several and then trim them all at once. In fact, when I can, I like to leave a lot of trimming till the end so I can sit in a comfy chair and move the work on my lap as needed. Either way, I always try to keep a garbage can and a lint roller nearby because this can make quite a mess, and then you can't really see your piece emerging when it's covered with lint and clippings. In this case, with this piece, I do think it's helping for me to be able to see how each one turns out before I do very much more. I think in a few cases I might stitch 2 and then trim them, but mostly I'm doing them one at a time. In this way, I do a bunch and then I stop because we have many more tricks up our sleeves. I think my proportions could be better, but I'm starting to like this quite a bit. That's the only North Star I have, so I follow it. I hope I can get these peacock feather bushes to work in a way that I like. This seems like a good time to check in with the mini. Remember that I dealt with the planted trees along the horizon even before stitching my sky. Also remember that I didn't like my side bushes on the mini at all. It is of note that I actually used marker in the water and branches and then thread painted those areas before adding more trees and bushes on this mini. So my work order was quite a bit different. I made the mini weeks ago and I was very impatient to see if I could achieve the right effect. It was just a case of dealing with the area of most urgency first. In making your piece, whether you're working on a mini or a full-size wall quilt, the order in which to approach the tasks will be your decision alone, as well as what to add or omit. So as we look at the mini, please just ignore the marking and stitching you see in my trees and water for now. The process adding these trees and bushes to the mini is very much the same as it was on the full-size piece. I'm just thinking and planning and trying to decide what I think things would look like in my mind's eye. And I'm paying a lot of attention to areas that seem like they could use something. The whole far shore on this piece is a little bit baggier than I would have liked it to be. And because I don't have a plan to put the lights on it all, I use yellow thread to add more trees and bushes, which will tighten things up and also add more going on when you get close up and look at it. I sort of feel, for some reason, like I'm going to keep all of the orange stitching on the right side of the landscape and have exclusively the teal on the other side. And I don't really have a reason for that. It just seemed like it might be nice. And so that's what I did. If I need to sketch something beforehand, I just get a piece of paper and do that. I'm sorry you can't see this. I didn't re-aim the camera. But I'm trying to change the character of these pine bough shapes that I did. And on the left side, I do it by changing the direction of the ones near the bottom. And I just want it to sort of look like it's ground sort of flowing this direction instead of it seeming like some odd plant shape. And then I extend the quilting over towards the center a little bit more. It was just too uniform before, and so I didn't like it. In order to obscure that uniformity, I'm doing it one way on one side. On the other side, I relied more on the literal bushes that I stitched out. I don't really need to do too much to this. And it's so small, you know, that you can't do that much. I mean, you could. You could work on this for 5 days if you wanted, and I'm sure it could be really awesome. But I'm just trying to create the impression of a landscape with this body of water and some uncertainty about what's really out there. I think it's pretty cute. Thanks.